The sharp snap of a serving tray slamming shut cut through the cabin like unguk. 10-year-old Micah Ellison, seated neatly in 2A with his book in hand, looked up at the flight attendant towering over him. Her glare was cold, her voice sharp enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Keep your hands to yourself," she barked. "You don't get to touch the call button whenever you feel like it." Micah hadn't said a word. He had only reached for the reading light. Now every passenger in first class turned to watch as the woman stepped closer, wagging a finger in his face as if he were a misbehaving child. Phones lifted discreetly. A few gasps floated in the air. Micah didn't cry. He didn't shrink. He simply folded his small hands in his lap and sat very still, his steady gaze fixed on her. There was something in that calmness, almost regal, that unsettled the adults watching. What the attendant didn't realize was that Micah's quiet strength would carry far beyond this cabin. It would reach boardrooms, headlines, and ultimately force the airline to its knees. 2 rows back, a man with the same sharp eyes and the quiet weight of authority watched the exchange without a word. Elijah Ellison, Micah's father and the billionaire majority owner of the airline, slid his phone from his jacket pocket and started to type. The storm had just begun, 30,000 feet above the ground. Welcome to Respect Wins Stories, the place where powerful tales come alive. No matter where you are watching this video from, whether it is New York, Texas, California, or anywhere across the United States, or even from the other side of the world, I would love to know, where are you watching from today? Please share it in the comments below while you sit back, relax, and dive into a story that will move your heart and spark your imagination. Every story here carries a message, because in the end, respect always wins. Let us begin. Micah Ellison was not the sort of 10-year-old most people expected to meet in first class. Small for his age, with neatly parted hair and a habit of keeping his book balanced on his knees, he carried himself with the quiet stillness of someone far older. He didn't fidget, didn't tap his feet, he listened, and when he did speak, it was usually with a thoughtfulness that caught adults off guard. His father, Elijah Ellison, was seated 2 rows behind him that evening, deliberately giving Micah a sense of independence. To most passengers, Elijah was just another sharply dressed traveler tapping through emails on his phone. But in the world of aviation, he was a name that could tilt markets. As the founder and majority owner of Eclipse Airways, he had built the company from a small regional fleet into a global powerhouse. He had chosen to fly commercial tonight for the simplest of reasons. He wanted his son to experience an ordinary trip before life grew any bigger for him. The decision to separate their seats had been Micah's idea. "I want to prove I can sit by myself," he'd said that morning, tucking his book into his backpack. Elijah had agreed with a smile, proud of his son's poise. What neither of them expected was that this simple choice would place Micah directly in the path of a flight attendant whose temper outweighed her sense of judgment. That single clash, witnessed by a cabin full of strangers, would ripple far beyond the flight, drawing in corporate boards, legal teams, and eventually the headlines. The stage for the reckoning was set long before the wheels even left the runway. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft evening glow as the plane taxied out toward the runway. Micah sat upright in 2A, his seatbelt neatly buckled, his book open on his lap. The other first-class passengers had already settled in with drinks or headphones, but more than a few kept sneaking glances at the boy, impressed by how still and composed he was. The attendant, Taylor, moved briskly up the aisle, checking belts and overhead bins with a snap of her fingers against the latches. When she stopped at Micah's row, she frowned slightly, as though the sight of a child traveling alone offended some unspoken rule. "Seatbelt secure?" she asked curtly. "Yes, ma'am," Micah answered, polite and soft-spoken. Her eyes flicked to his book. "Keep that tray table up until we're at cruising altitude," she added, even though it was already locked in place. Then she moved on without a word of acknowledgement. 2 rows back, Elijah Ellison looked up from his phone just long enough to notice the brief exchange. He saw Micah's shoulders straighten a little, as if bracing against the attendant's tone, then lower again when she passed. Elijah's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. He wanted to see how his son handled it. Micah had asked for independence, and Elijah trusted his resilience. Moments later, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and Miss Taylor returned with a stack of menus. When she reached Micah, she didn't offer him a menu, just said, "You'll have the kids' meal." "I'd like the pasta, please," Micah said, pointing to the regular entree pictured on the card in the pocket. Taylor gave a short laugh. "That's for adults. We don't serve that to children traveling alone." "I'm allergic to peanuts," Micah replied calmly. "The kids' meal lists peanut sauce." Her brows pinched. "Then you'll eat around it," she said, already turning away. Several passengers looked up, startled by her dismissive tone. A man in the opposite aisle lowered his newspaper, watching closely. Micah didn't protest further. He folded his menu and went back to his book. But his stillness wasn't surrender, it was the same composed patience he always kept when adults underestimated him. Elijah caught the tail end of the exchange, his jaw tightening slightly. He typed something on his phone, short, decisive, and slipped it back into his jacket. As drink service began, Miss Taylor continued to treat Micah as if he were a nuisance rather than a passenger. She placed his water down with a little more force than necessary, enough for droplets to splash against his sleeve. He quietly dabbed at the spill with his napkin, his expression unchanged. The businessman across the aisle shifted forward. "Excuse me," he said to the attendant. "The boy's been perfectly polite. Maybe you could ease up a little." Taylor shot him a tight smile. "Sir, I'm responsible for safety in this cabin. I know how to do my job." The man raised his brows but let the matter drop for now. Micah remained silent through it all, his gaze fixed on the words of his book, though his small fingers pressed a little harder against the pages. To anyone watching closely, that grip said more than words. Above the hum of the engines, a sense of unease settled over first class, like static before a storm. The passengers had witnessed enough to realize something wasn't right, and a few began recording short clips on their phones just in case. Elijah leaned back in his seat, outwardly calm but keeping one eye on his son. He had promised Micah a simple flight, an ordinary trip. Now he could feel that promise slipping away with every curt word and careless gesture from the crew. The real confrontation hadn't even begun, yet the cabin already felt charged. An invisible line had been crossed, and everyone sensed it. By the time the plane leveled at 30,000 feet, the first-class cabin had grown tense in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. Micah closed his book and folded his hands neatly in his lap, waiting patiently for meal service. The faint red mark where water had splashed on his sleeve was already dry, but the sting of being dismissed lingered in the air like smoke. When Miss Taylor returned with trays, her smile was tight and performative. She leaned down to the woman in 1C, speaking in syrupy tones. "And here's your filet, cooked medium just as you requested." She set the dish down with both hands, bowing her head in exaggerated courtesy. But when she reached Micah, she didn't bother to crouch or smile. She plunked a tray onto his table with a plastic-wrapped kids' meal, its cartoon airplane logo almost mocking. "I told you pasta only for adults," she said briskly. "This will do." Micah studied the tray for a moment. The peanut sauce packet glistened under the cabin lights. He didn't touch it. The man across the aisle spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "He already told you he has an allergy. That's unsafe." Miss Taylor straightened, crossing her arms. "Sir, with respect, I am the crew lead in this cabin. I'm following procedure." A ripple of discontent traveled through the rows. A woman in 3A leaned forward, whispering loudly enough to be heard, "Procedure doesn't include endangering a child." Several phones lifted higher, recording openly now. The light from the screens caught Taylor's eye, and for the first time a flicker of unease crossed her face. She masked it quickly with another brittle smile. Micah sat silently, his calm presence drawing more eyes than if he had burst into tears. His stillness unsettled the adults. His restraint made Taylor's arrogance shine brighter in contrast. 2 rows back, Elijah closed his laptop. He had let the incident play out long enough. His dark eyes locked on his son's seat, then on the attendant standing over him. He reached for his phone again, tapping a message with swift precision. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Unusually formal, ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as meal service concludes. We will be addressing a brief operational matter shortly. Micah glanced down at his lap where his phone buzzed softly with a text. From his father, "Stay calm, I'm here." The boy's lips curved in the faintest smile, invisible to most. But Elijah caught it. He leaned back in his seat, fingers steepled, watching. Taylor, meanwhile, doubled down. She bent close to Micah and hissed under her breath, "You may fool the others with your quiet act, but you don't fool me. Sit there, eat what you're given, and stop causing trouble." Her words carried just far enough for the businessman across the aisle to hear. His jaw dropped. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head as his phone camera captured every word. The woman behind him spoke louder this time. "I think we've all seen enough. This boy has done nothing wrong." A murmur of agreement rolled through the cabin like a slow wave. Taylor straightened abruptly, flustered by the open resistance. She tried to smile again, but it faltered under the weight of 24 eyes staring back at her, not in deference, but in judgment. Micah remained motionless, his composure unbroken. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. His silence was louder than her authority. And somewhere deep in the systems of Eclipse Airways, the message Elijah had just sent was already setting wheels in motion that Miss Taylor could never stop. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane entered evening skies over the Midwest. Outside the windows, the horizon was a long ribbon of copper fading into violet, but inside first class, the air felt tight, brittle as glass. Micah pushed the untouched kids' meal gently toward the edge of his tray. The peanut sauce packet sat unopened like a warning sign. Miss Taylor noticed and stopped beside him, hands on hips. "You haven't eaten," she said. "I suggest you start before it gets cold." "I can't," Micah replied evenly. "I'm allergic." Her lips pursed. "You'll have to make do. We don't have other meals for unaccompanied minors." A man's voice rose from the next row. "That's not acceptable," said the businessman who had been defending Micah all evening. "You're ignoring a medical restriction. That's not just rude, it's a safety issue." Taylor turned on him sharply. "Sir, this is between me and the passenger. Please don't interfere again." The businessman raised his phone a little higher. "Fine, I'll just document it for the FAA." That comment drew a ripple of low gasps and murmurs. Several passengers angled their phones too, screens glowing like a constellation in the cabin. Taylor flushed and leaned toward Micah, lowering her voice. "Put the tray away, then. You're wasting good food." Micah folded the tray up carefully without looking at her. His calmness now felt almost regal, an unspoken refusal to let her provoke him. In row 4, a young woman shook her head and muttered, "This is beyond unprofessional." Taylor heard her and snapped, "Everyone mind your own seat." The brittle cheer in her voice had cracked entirely. She sounded defensive now, cornered. 2 rows back, Elijah finally set aside his tablet and stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the aisle. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried without being loud, "I believe that's enough." Taylor stiffened at once. "Sir, please remain seated. We're in flight." Elijah's gaze stayed steady. "My son has been polite from the moment he boarded. You've ignored his medical needs and spoken to him in a way no passenger should endure. I'm asking you politely to stop." The stillness in his tone made several passengers glance at one another. It wasn't anger they heard, it was authority. Taylor opened her mouth to reply, then seemed to think better of it. She turned away abruptly and disappeared into the galley, the curtain swinging shut behind her. The businessman leaned toward Elijah. "Glad you said something. That boy's handled this better than most adults would." Elijah inclined his head in thanks, then rested a hand briefly on Micah's shoulder as he passed his son's seat. Micah looked up, meeting his father's eyes without speaking. That brief exchange, the squeeze of a shoulder, the calm in their gazes, told the passengers everything they needed to know about who this child was. From the galley came the muffled sound of a phone being slammed onto its receiver, followed by the hiss of the curtains sliding again as Taylor re-emerged with a tight-lipped smile that convinced no one. Elijah sat back down, already unlocking his phone. A single call icon appeared on the screen, one that connected straight to Eclipse Airways' chief of operations. He tapped it once, raised the phone to his ear, and spoke quietly enough for only the man across the aisle to catch a few words. Crew conduct, immediate report, document everything on landing. The businessman's eyebrows shot up. Clearly, this wasn't just any frustrated parent making a complaint. By the time the call ended, Elijah's expression was as composed as his son's, calm, unshaken, but carrying the weight of a decision already made. At 33,000 feet, the balance of power in that cabin had shifted. No one applauded, no one cheered, but the silent agreement passed between the passengers. The real turbulence was yet to come on the ground. The engines hummed steady as the plane carved through the night sky, but in first class, the atmosphere was anything but smooth. Micah had returned to his book, unbothered on the surface, though his stillness carried more weight now. His quiet dignity was no longer just noticed. It was admired. Passengers exchanged looks, their phones angled discreetly, their loyalty tilting away from the uniform in the aisle. 2 rows back, Elijah Ellison's phone buzzed once. Call connected. Status: a crisp voice answered instantly. It belonged to Jordan Pierce, Eclipse Airways Chief of Operations, a man who rarely heard from Elijah mid-flight. There's been an incident with a lead attendant on Flight 227, Elijah said evenly. Document it. When we land, she is to be relieved of duty immediately. I want corporate security at the gate. Pierce didn't hesitate. Understood, sir. Consider it handled. Elijah ended the call without another word, slipped the phone back into his jacket, and reclined in his seat as though nothing had happened. But around him, subtle currents shifted. The businessman across the aisle leaned back with widened eyes. The young woman in row 4 pressed her lips together in realization. This was no ordinary passenger. Up front, the captain's interphone chimed. He picked it up, listened for a moment, then glanced toward first class with new awareness in his expression. He didn't announce anything, but the shift in his demeanor was enough to stir the cabin crew. Miss Taylor, unaware of the exact conversation but sensing the air had turned, straightened her shoulders and tried to resume her rounds. Her smile was stretched thin, her movements less sharp than before. When a passenger asked for water, her hands shook just enough to splash against the rim of the glass. Jasmine, a woman seated diagonally across from Micah, whispered to her seatmate, "Who is that man?" nodding discreetly toward Elijah. The seatmate shrugged. "Whoever he is, she's finished." Micah finally looked up from his book, eyes meeting his father's for a brief second. Elijah gave the slightest nod, a silent reassurance. Micah returned to his reading, but the message was clear. Justice was already on its way. 15 minutes later, another interphone chime called Miss Taylor forward. The captain's voice was low, but the color drained from her face as she listened. She stiffened, tried to speak, then stopped. Her eyes darted back toward 2A, where Micah sat quietly, and then to Elijah, who had not moved. Passengers noticed. Whispers ran down the rows. "Something's happening. She's in trouble." "Did you see her face?" Taylor returned to the galley without a word. Her confidence cracked, her once commanding stride reduced to hurried step. Victor, a young tech worker in 3C, lowered his phone and whispered, "I think the airline already knows." The businessman across the aisle chuckled softly. "Knows? They probably know exactly who they just messed with." By now, the entire first-class cabin was complicit in the quiet theater unfolding at 33,000 feet. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. They simply watched as authority shifted from a uniformed attendant to the calm silence of a boy and the quiet power of his father. For Taylor, every second of the flight had begun to feel heavier, each chime of the interphone like a hammer striking closer to her career. For Elijah and Micah, it was only a matter of time before the reckoning touched down. Night had deepened outside the cabin windows. Scattered city lights far below shimmered like constellations. Inside first-class, conversation dwindled to cautious whispers. Everyone sensed that something invisible and powerful was already at work. Elijah remained seated with the same composed posture, scrolling through email as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But a few passengers now stole glances at him with quiet curiosity. The businessman in 2C nudged his seatmate and whispered, "He called somebody. Did you see how fast she went pale?" Micah sat with his book closed, gazing at the oval window, the reflection of his face calm and almost solemn. The boy hadn't uttered a word since meal service ended, yet his silence continued to unsettle Taylor more than if he'd cried or complained. In the cockpit, the captain received another priority message over e-cars. Ground control at LAX had confirmed that corporate security and a representative from the CEO's office would be waiting at the arrival gate. The message included a single line that caught his attention: "Owner on board, treat discreetly. Gather crew statements upon arrival." The captain glanced at the cabin crew roster displayed on the screen, then at the curtain that separated him from first class. He now understood exactly who the owner was. In the galley, Taylor poured herself water, hands trembling. She'd noticed the passengers filming her earlier and now kept stealing looks toward 2A, toward the boy whose poise she couldn't shake from her mind. A young attendant from economy entered the galley to restock drinks. Leaning closer, she whispered, "Is something going on up here? Everyone's acting weird." Taylor forced a thin smile. "Everything's fine, just routine." But her voice cracked on the last word. Meanwhile, Elijah received a short encrypted message on his phone. "Pierce Ox, security positioned. Legal counsel en route. Will meet you at Jet Bridge." He typed back "acknowledged." The businessman across the aisle noticed the discreet exchange, noting the corporate-style tone on the screen. "Definitely not just any passenger," he muttered under his breath. 20 minutes before landing, the captain's calm announcement came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent into Los Angeles, please remain seated after we reach the gate. A brief documentation procedure will be conducted before disembarking." The phrasing "documentation procedure" sent a ripple of curiosity down the rows. Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks, others simply tightened their belts and waited. Micah turned toward his father. "Is it almost over?" he asked quietly. Elijah's expression softened. "Almost. Just stay calm a little longer." The exchange was brief, but it caught the eyes of the nearby passengers. A father's reassurance, a son's composed nod. It deepened the sense that something far larger than a service complaint was unfolding. At the rear of first class, Taylor's composure crumbled further. She fumbled with the manifest tablet, pretending to review paperwork. The younger attendant caught her uneasy expression and said gently, "You okay?" Taylor gave no reply, only a stiff shrug. Below them on the tarmac, two black SUVs with skylight blue emblems rolled up beside the designated gate. Corporate security agents stepped out first, followed by a man in a tailored suit carrying a slim leather briefcase. The CEO's chief legal officer. Airport staff nearby paused to watch. Clearly, this was no routine arrival. In the cabin, passengers could feel the descent as the aircraft dipped through a layer of thin cloud. The wing lights glowed red and green against the dark sky, and the engines softened to a steady drone. The hush inside the cabin felt almost ceremonial, as though everyone was holding their breath for what would greet them once the wheels touched down. For Micah, it was just the end of a long flight. For Taylor, every mile closer to the ground felt like a countdown. For Elijah, it was simply the closing act of a decision already made. The wheels thumped against the runway with a heavy jolt that rippled through every seat. For a few seconds, only the roar of the engines filled the cabin. Then the aircraft slowed to a long, smooth roll toward Gate 27. The seatbelt sign stayed lit even after they came to a stop. A few passengers reached instinctively for the overhead bins, only to freeze when the captain's voice came through the speakers. Calm, deliberate, but carrying an unusual weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, for safety and documentation purposes, please remain seated until further notice. We appreciate your patience." The usual cheerful welcome was gone. The words "documentation purposes" hung in the air like a warning bell. Micah sat quietly, his book closed on his lap. He didn't fidget, didn't glance around. He simply waited as if he somehow knew the script that was about to unfold. Across the aisle, phones tilted discreetly upward. A woman whispered to her husband, "Something big's about to happen." Taylor stood frozen near the galley curtain, shoulders square but her grip on the headrest so tight her knuckles had gone pale. She kept her eyes fixed on the closed cabin door as though willing it not to open. A sharp metallic hiss broke the silence. The door swung inward. Two uniformed corporate security agents stepped inside first, scanning the cabin with practiced calm. Behind them came a tall man in a charcoal suit carrying a leather folio embossed with the Eclipse Airways crest. The lead agent addressed the passengers with a brief nod. "Thank you for remaining seated. We need to speak with a member of the cabin crew before disembarkation begins." Every eye shifted toward Taylor. The suited man consulted a tablet, then looked up. "Lead flight attendant Miss Taylor, please gather your belongings and step forward." A collective hush spread through first class. Someone in row 3 murmured, "Wow, this is serious." Taylor's voice wavered. I have to secure the cabin first." The agent's tone stayed courteous but firm. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. We'll handle that. Please come with us." Taylor moved stiffly toward the door, pausing as she passed 2A. For the briefest moment, her eyes met Micah's. His calm, steady gaze didn't waver. She looked away first, then continued forward with the agents. The businessman across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "I knew it. She's done." As Taylor disappeared into the jet bridge, the suited man turned back to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin deplaning shortly. We appreciate your patience and especially your cooperation as we review a safety matter that took place during this flight." Several passengers exchanged looks, their curiosity now an open hum in the air. The man in 2C cleared his throat and asked, "Excuse me, are we allowed to give statements?" "Certainly," the agent replied. "We'll collect voluntary witness accounts at the gate area." The businessman glanced toward Elijah, who sat 2 rows back, still composed, phone in hand. At last curiosity overcame restraint. "Sir," he said quietly to Elijah, "if you don't mind me asking, are you—" Elijah offered a polite, almost apologetic smile. "Elijah Ellison," he said simply, "owner of Eclipse Airways." A small gasp rolled through the cabin like a breeze. A woman in 3A whispered, "That explains everything." Even those who hadn't recorded the incident now understood why corporate security had been waiting at the gate, why the captain's tone had changed mid-flight. Micah looked up at his father, then lowered his gaze again as if none of it surprised him. The tension that had once filled the cabin with dread now shifted into a quiet sense of justice in motion, as if the entire aircraft had tilted back toward balance without leaving the ground. The cabin door stayed open as passengers remained seated, watching the quiet exchange on the jet bridge. Through the narrow gap of the curtain, they could see Taylor standing stiffly with 2 security agents, while the suited man from corporate spoke to her in a low, measured tone. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from tense curiosity to an almost solemn calm. Micah sat still in his seat, his book balanced on his knees like a shield he no longer needed. Elijah rested a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and gave a small nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," the suited man announced as he stepped back inside, "thank you for your patience. We'll begin deplaning row by row. If you witnessed the incident involving our crew, we invite you to provide a statement at the gate lounge. We appreciate your cooperation." Passengers began to rise, some pausing to nod at Micah as they passed. A woman in 3A stopped briefly and said softly, "You handled yourself like a champ, young man." Micah managed a polite smile in return. Victor, the tech worker who had been recording since the first argument, lingered until most others had left. He approached Elijah quietly. "I've got photos and video if legal needs them. I'll be happy to share." Elijah shook his hand. "We appreciate that. Someone from our legal team will reach out to you. Thank you for stepping in when you did." At the gate, 2 podiums had been set up, one for witness statements, another for regular passengers ready to exit. The line for statements grew as several first-class travelers volunteered to recount what they'd seen. From the food allergy dismissal to Taylor's tone and the way Micah had remained calm throughout. Taylor stood to the side near the jet bridge door, her uniform jacket now folded over one arm, her ID badge clipped to her boarding pass as she prepared to surrender it. The security agent beside her spoke softly but firmly. "Miss Taylor, per corporate instruction, you're relieved of duty as of now and placed on immediate suspension pending full review. You'll be escorted to HR after this." Her response was little more than a nod, Her earlier authority was gone, replaced by the weight of the decision just delivered. Meanwhile, Micah and Elijah were ushered into a small glass-walled conference room off the gate lounge. A senior member of the operations team greeted them with a respectful handshake. "Mr. Ellison, we're deeply sorry for what you and your son experienced. We'll be filing a full incident report with the FAA and conducting an internal review starting tonight. We'd also like to arrange a follow-up medical check for your son to ensure he's all right." Micah shook his head gently. "I'm okay," he said quietly, earning an admiring glance from the officer. Elijah replied, "Thank you. We'll comply with whatever the investigation requires. My son's fine physically, but we need to make sure this never happens again." As they spoke, passengers who had finished their statements came by to offer quiet words of support. One man said, "I've flown for 30 years, never seen a child treated like that. You both handled it with real grace." Micah listened, a little shy but appreciative, while Elijah thanked each person sincerely. By the time the last passenger left, the scene had transformed. What had begun as humiliation in the air had ended in a public show of accountability on the ground. Elijah placed a hand on Micah's shoulder once more. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than most adults could have." Micah simply nodded, the weight of the night finally beginning to lift. By dawn the next morning, Eclipse Airways headquarters in Los Angeles buzzed like it was the start of a major earnings call. Executives had been summoned for an emergency meeting, their suits pressed, coffee cups clutched like armor. The overnight incident memo titled Flight 227 First Class Passenger Grievance Owner on Board had already circulated through every department. In the glass-walled boardroom on the top floor, Elijah Ellison entered in a dark suit, calm but unmistakably in command. Micah had stayed home with his grandmother. Elijah wanted him spared from the corporate theater. "Let's get one thing straight," Elijah began, standing at the head of the table. "What happened last night wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was a failure of culture, of the promise we make to every passenger." Heads around the table nodded. No one dared to interrupt. He outlined what he had witnessed in concise detail. The tone of voice, the dismissal of a food allergy, the humiliating remarks. Then he listed his directives, training reforms, a zero-tolerance protocol for misconduct, mandatory de-escalation workshops, and a revised grievance hotline routed directly to corporate. The chief of operations added, "Security has Taylor's preliminary statement. Legal is coordinating with the FAA. We've received 12 passenger statements so far, 8 from first class, 4 from economy who heard or saw parts of the confrontation." "Good," Elijah replied. "Make sure those passengers get personal thank yous. Their willingness to speak up will help us fix what's broken." While the boardroom absorbed his words, the story outside was spreading fast. Several national outlets picked up the headline, "Billionaire Owner's Son Targeted by Crew Airline Responds Overnight." Back at the Ellison residence, Micah scrolled cautiously through messages on his tablet. A stream of emails had arrived, some from passengers who'd been on Flight 227, others from strangers who'd read the story. One note from a woman in 3A read, "Dear Micah, I want you to know you were the bravest person on that plane. You reminded us adults that staying calm is sometimes the strongest answer." Micah read it twice, cheeks flushing with a mix of pride and embarrassment. He saved the email, unsure what to reply yet. Meanwhile, Elijah concluded the meeting at HQ by inviting the head of HR to join him for a walkthrough of the cabin crew training center. "I want to look every new recruit in the eye," he said. "They need to know this isn't just policy, it's personal." Later that afternoon, Elijah and the HR lead visited a class of recruits in their crisp Navy uniforms. He kept his remarks brief but firm. "You're the first and last human contact our passengers see on every flight. We owe them dignity and safety. Last night we failed one passenger who happens to be my son, but what matters is that we never fail anyone again." The recruits listened in near silence. Several nodded solemnly. The instructor later confided to HR that no lecture had ever hit harder than that 5-minute talk. That evening, back at home, Micah was still reading through messages when Elijah returned. His father set down his briefcase and smiled faintly. "Busy day?" he asked. Micah looked up. "A lot of people wrote to me. Some said I was brave." He hesitated, then added, I just didn't want to make things worse. Elijah ruffled his son's hair gently. You didn't make anything worse. You reminded grown-ups what respect looks like. Micah's quiet grin lingered as they moved to the dining table where the rest of the family waited for dinner. For the first time since the flight, the evening meal felt easy, like a return to ordinary life. But in offices across the airline, Elijah's directives had already set off a chain of changes. Eclipse Airways would never board passengers the same way again. 2 days after the flight, Eclipse Airways released a carefully worded public statement. It appeared first on the company's website, then rippled across every major news outlet. Eclipse Airways extends its sincerest apology to our passenger Micah Ellison and his family. We have suspended the crew member involved and launched a comprehensive review of training and onboard conduct. We are committed to ensuring every customer, regardless of age, receives respect and care throughout their journey. The post drew tens of thousands of comments in the first 24 hours. Most were messages of support, proud of this company for acting fast. Micah's composure is inspiring. Crew training everywhere should follow this example. A handful of travelers shared their own experiences of feeling dismissed in first class or ignored over medical requests, adding weight to the need for change. The airline's rapid, transparent response quickly became a talking point on morning shows and business segments alike. Meanwhile, Taylor's formal suspension letter was delivered by courier to her home. The document outlined that she would remain on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the FAA inquiry and Eclipse's internal ethics review. Her union confirmed receipt without public comment, but industry blogs reported that her case was likely to set a precedent for future passenger care policies. For Micah, the attention was unexpected and sometimes overwhelming. He stayed home from school for a few days with his parents' blessing. While letters and small packages arrived at the Ellison residence, hand-drawn cards from children, thank you notes from passengers, even a leather-bound notebook sent anonymously with the message, "For your future stories, keep writing them with the same grace you showed in the sky." At the breakfast table one morning, Micah opened a handwritten note from a retired pilot. "Son, in my 35 years of flying, I've never seen a passenger your age carry himself with such calm under pressure. You reminded the adults on board what professionalism looks like." Micah folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the notebook's front pocket, unsure why it made his throat tighten. Elijah watched his son quietly, recognizing that the ordeal had left more than a headline. It had left an imprint on the boy's sense of the world. Later that day, he told his wife, "The challenge now is to let Micah be a kid again, to remind him that calm is good, but he doesn't always have to carry the weight of adults' mistakes." At Eclipse headquarters, new briefing sessions were rolled out for all cabin crew teams. Slides from the training featured a single sentence in bold at the start: "Dignity is the first step in safety." The HR director credited both Elijah's directives and Jasmine's, Micah's mother's, private suggestions for shaping the curriculum. When reporters asked Elijah for a televised interview, he declined politely. "This isn't about publicity," he told them. "It's about changing how we treat people." Instead, the only public appearance he allowed was a brief statement at a charity gala already on the family's calendar. He stood beside Micah at the podium and said, "We're proud of our son for remaining calm and respectful when he had every right to be angry. We'll keep working to ensure no other passenger, child, or adult has to endure what he did." The applause that followed wasn't the raucous kind reserved for celebrity speeches. It was warm, genuine, and carried a note of respect that resonated through the room. That night, as the family returned home, Micah set the notebook on his desk and glanced at the sky through his bedroom window. For the first time since the flight, the view of a passing plane didn't feel heavy with memory. It looked once again like a vessel for adventure. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the airline had changed. A boy had discovered his quiet strength, and the passengers who witnessed it all carried home a story about dignity prevailing at 33,000. A week after the incident, the Ellison home finally settled into its usual rhythm: early breakfast, homework reminders, the low hum of the espresso machine in the kitchen. The media vans that had camped at the curb were gone now, leaving behind nothing but flattened grass and a few stray camera marks on the sidewalk. Micah spent most of his mornings in the sunny corner of the living room where a shelf of books lined the wall. The leather-bound notebook someone had sent him sat on the coffee table beside a mug of cocoa that had long since cooled. Every so often he would open the notebook, flip past the first blank pages, and reread the letter from the retired pilot tucked in the front pocket. It wasn't the praise that made him linger over the words, it was the feeling that someone out there truly understood him. His mother, Jasmine, often joined him on the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. Though she rarely commented on the headlines, she noticed the way Micah's brow would furrow whenever he scrolled through articles about the flight. One morning she reached over and covered his screen gently. "Enough reading about it," she said softly. "You lived it. You don't need to relive it every day." Micah gave a small nod and closed the tablet. "I just like seeing what people say," he admitted. "They don't sound mad. Mostly they sound kind." Jasmine smiled faintly. "They should. You reminded them what kindness looks like." That evening, Elijah came home earlier than usual, trading his suit jacket for a sweater as soon as he walked through the door. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, warm bread, but it felt different from the tense meals of the week before. There was a sense of release in the air, like a storm had passed and left the house intact. After the meal, Micah retreated to his room and sat at his desk, pen in hand. He opened the notebook and began to write, not about the slap or the confrontation, but about the small moments he remembered from the flight. The shape of the clouds through the oval window, the hum of the engines, the way strangers had spoken up for him when they didn't have to. "I think most people want to do the right thing," he wrote. "Sometimes they just need to be reminded that it matters." Downstairs, Elijah paused outside his son's door, listening to the soft scratch of pen against paper. He chose not to interrupt. He understood that writing was Micah's way of working through things, of turning experience into meaning. Later that night, Elijah and Jasmine sat together in the living room, a quiet lamp casting warm light across the shelf. For the first time since the flight, Elijah admitted, "I was proud of how calm he stayed, but I hate that he had to learn that lesson so soon." Jasmine reached for his hand. "Maybe it's not the worst lesson," she said gently. "He saw what dignity looks like when the world tries to take it away. That's something many grown-ups never figure out." Elijah squeezed her hand back, the line of his shoulders easing. For a brief moment they both allowed themselves to simply be parents, grateful for the boy upstairs writing in his notebook, safe and sound. When Micah finally closed the journal, he felt lighter than he had in days. He slid the pen into the notebook's spine and set it by the window, where the moonlight caught its silver buckle. For the first time since the incident, he slept without waking from restless dreams. By the following week, Micah returned to school, greeted not by stares of pity, but by curious smiles. His classmates had seen his name in headlines, yet treated him as if he'd merely been away on an ordinary trip. It was exactly what he needed: normalcy. During homeroom, his teacher asked gently if he'd like to say anything about what had happened. Micah hesitated, then shook his head. But when a friend in the back raised a hand and asked, "Were you scared on the plane?" Micah found himself standing up anyway. "I wasn't scared," he said after a pause. "I was more disappointed. Grown-ups are supposed to protect kids, not embarrass them. But most of the people on that plane were kind, and that mattered more." The room stayed quiet for a heartbeat before his teacher said softly, "Thank you for telling us that." No one applauded, but the nods around the room felt more genuine than any clapping could have. That night at home, Micah recounted the exchange over dinner. Jasmine brushed his hair back with a smile. "You didn't just answer their question, you taught them something," she told him. Meanwhile, at Eclipse Airways, the ripple of change continued. Crew members began sharing internal posts about the new Dignity First training module, quoting Micah's words from media reports. "Sometimes calm is stronger than shouting." Supervisors noted a shift in cabin crew morale. Attendants started greeting passengers with renewed attentiveness, aware that small gestures mattered. The airline's community outreach team invited the Ellisons to a small event highlighting empathy in travel. Elijah was hesitant. He disliked publicity, but Micah agreed after learning it wasn't a press event but a gathering of staff and volunteers. The day of the event, Micah stood beside a large photo display of smiling passengers from around the world. A junior flight attendant approached him shyly, saying, "I started this job last month. Your story reminded me why kindness is part of the uniform. Micah nodded politely, unsure what to say at first, then replied, "It's nice when people remember that." Throughout the afternoon, he listened to others share stories of challenging flights, discovering that the work of keeping travelers safe and comfortable was often harder than it appeared. Hearing their side helped him see that empathy wasn't a one-way street. Later, as they left the building, Elijah remarked quietly to Jasmine, "He's learning things grown-ups struggle with, understanding both sides without losing himself." Jasmine smiled. "That's the best outcome we could hope for." At school the next week, Micah was asked to write an essay about a moment that changed the way you see the world. He chose to describe the feeling of sitting quietly in 2A, the hum of the engines beneath his shoes, and realizing that silence could be as powerful as shouting. His teacher displayed the essay on the classroom bulletin board, with his permission, under the title "Strength Can Be Quiet." Each step, the classroom talk, the essay, the quiet exchanges with crew, became a small marker of healing, transforming the incident from a wound into a story with purpose. The bruise to his dignity was slowly being replaced by confidence in his own voice. That evening, Micah added a line to his leather-bound notebook. "People listen more when you're calm, but sometimes you have to speak so they remember what calm looks like." Spring sunlight spilled through the Ellisons' dining room windows the morning Micah's story appeared in a national magazine under the headline, "The Boy Who Stayed Calm at 33,000. The article focused less on the incident itself and more on the ripple it had created. New airline training standards, passenger rights discussions on social media, and the way a quiet 10-year-old had become an unexpected symbol of dignity. Micah skimmed the piece over breakfast, frowning slightly at seeing his own face in print. "I don't really feel like a symbol," he said, pushing his cereal around the bowl. Elijah folded the magazine and set it aside. "You're not a symbol to us," he replied. "You're just Micah, but what you did helped other people pay attention. That's worth something." Jasmine reached across the table, resting her hand over Micah's. "Symbols fade," she said gently. "But the kindness you showed, that stays in people's memory." That weekend, the family drove to the coast to escape the press for a day. The ocean air was crisp and clean. Gulls circled lazily above the pier. Micah stood by the rail, notebook tucked under his arm, watching a plane draw a thin white line across the blue sky. For the first time since the flight, he looked at a jet without recalling the humiliation. Instead, he wondered where it was headed and who might be looking out its windows. Later, sitting on the sand, he began to write, "Maybe when I grow up, I'll build things that make travel safer and calmer for everyone. Maybe a better seatbelt for kids, or an app that helps passengers ask for help without feeling scared." Jasmine read the page over his shoulder and smiled. "That's a good start," she said. "Big changes often begin as little ideas in a notebook." That night, back home, Elijah tucked Micah's leather-bound journal into a drawer beside his son's bed for safekeeping. "I kept my first business plans in a notebook about that size," he told him. "Sometimes writing things down is the first step to building them." Micah looked thoughtful. "I used to think being calm meant doing nothing," he admitted. "Now I think it means deciding what matters before you act." Elijah nodded with quiet pride. "That's a lesson even adults spend years trying to learn." As the months passed, Eclipse Airways continued rolling out its Dignity First program across all hubs. Crew members often mentioned Micah's name during workshops as a reminder of why the reforms matter. Some sent the family notes saying the training had changed the way they greeted nervous passengers or handled small conflicts in the cabin. Micah didn't always read those messages, but when he did, he added them to a growing folder he titled "Proof That People Can Change." On the evening of his 11th birthday, surrounded by a few friends, balloons and a chocolate chip cake, Micah made a wish before blowing out the candle. He didn't share it aloud, but later that night he jotted it down in his journal. "Wish that every kid who flies can feel safe, even when grown-ups forget how to act." Elijah found the note weeks later while helping tidy the room, and felt a quiet swell of pride, not just for his son's composure that night on the plane, but for the empathy that had taken root because of it. The incident on Flight 27 had started as an act of arrogance in a crowded cabin, yet it had ended as a story about respect, resilience, and how even the smallest voice can steady an entire room. And as another plane's distant hum drifted through the night sky outside his window, Micah closed his notebook and whispered to himself, "Next time I fly, I want it to feel like an adventure again." For the first time since that fateful evening, the thought of flying made him smile. And that's another story shared here on Respect Wins Stories. If this one touched you, inspired you, or made you think, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring more powerful stories your way. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments, and let's see how far these stories travel across America. Remember, no matter the struggle, no matter the ending, respect always wins. See you in the next story.